The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, as Officer Greg Stanton adjusted his patrol cap and prepared for another routine evening on duty. The small-town streets were quiet, as usual, a far cry from the chaos of the big city he once worked in. Greg liked it that way. Less trouble, fewer headaches. He prided himself on keeping the peace, ensuring every corner of his jurisdiction was safe and sound, his personal mantra. But that night, he was about to face a situation that would shake him to his core. As he cruised down Maple Avenue, his eyes caught sight of a young woman sitting alone on a park bench. She looked out of place, vulnerable somehow. The streetlights cast long shadows, but her figure remained distinct. A slim frame, hunched slightly forward, her face partly hidden under the brim of a worn cap. Greg slowed his patrol car, curiosity prickling the back of his neck. His instincts kicked in. Why was she out here alone? The park was nearly empty, and it wasn't exactly the safest part of town. He decided to check it out. With a sigh, he pulled the car to the curb and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Evening, miss," he called, his voice firm, but not unkind. She flinched, her head snapping up. Big, wary eyes met his. She was young, barely out of her teens, if that. Her hands gripped a small backpack like it was her lifeline. "Everything okay?" "Yes, officer," she replied quickly, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I'm just sitting here." Greg's gaze narrowed. Her response seemed polite, but something about her posture told a different story. She was stiff, defensive, as though she expected trouble. He glanced at the backpack and then at her face again. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here so late?" he pressed, his tone remaining neutral. The girl hesitated. Her lips parted as though she wanted to explain, but then she clamped her mouth shut. That moment of silence felt heavy, almost like she was deciding how much of her truth to share. "I'm just passing through," she finally said, avoiding his eyes. Greg crossed his arms, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling heavier than usual. "Passing through? Where to?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Nowhere specific." Her vague answers set off a small alarm in his mind. As an officer, he'd been trained to trust his gut, and right now, his gut was telling him there was more to this story. He stepped closer, keeping his voice even but firm. "Do you have ID on you?" The girl's grip on her backpack tightened. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." Greg's brows furrowed. He didn't want to escalate things, but her resistance wasn't helping. "Look, I'm just trying to make sure everything's okay. If you're not from around here, I need to know who I'm talking to. It's standard procedure." She hesitated again before slowly reaching into her bag. The pause felt eternal, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, she handed over an ID card. Greg took it, glancing at the name. Amara Fields *. "All right, Amara," he said, reading the name aloud. "You from around here?" She shook her head. "No, I'm just passing through, like I said." Greg was about to ask another question when his radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. He stepped back, answering the call, but his eyes stayed locked on Amara. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. As he returned the radio to his belt, Greg noticed a faint scar on Amara's wrist. It wasn't obvious at first, but in the dim light, it caught his eye. He opened his mouth to ask about it when a sharp noise broke the stillness, a car door slamming in the distance. Amara flinched, her eyes darting toward the sound, and for the first time, Greg saw something else in her expression: fear. Pure, raw fear. It sent a chill down his spine. "Amara," he said gently, his tone softening, "is there something you're not telling me?" Her breathing quickened, and she shook her head, but her body language told a different story. She was hiding something. He could feel it. Before he could press further, headlights flashed in the distance, and a black sedan slowly rolled into view. Amara stiffened, her fingers clutching her backpack tighter. Greg's instincts went into overdrive. Whoever was in that car wasn't just passing through. He turned toward the vehicle, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered weapon. The sedan came to a stop a few yards away, and the driver's window began to roll down. Greg could sense it, the tension, the danger. And just like that, the situation escalated from a routine patrol to something far more complicated. What was Amara running from? And who was in that car? Greg didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This night was far from over. Greg's pulse quickened as he stood his ground, eyes trained on the black sedan. The hum of its engine was the only sound breaking the quiet of the night. The driver's window was now fully lowered, but inside, the dim light obscured the person's face. Greg didn't move closer. Years of experience had taught him that rushing into the unknown was a rookie mistake. Instead, he shot a quick glance back at Amara. Her face was pale, and her wide eyes were glued to the car. She looked like she was caught between running and freezing in place. "Stay here," Greg said firmly, his voice low. Amara didn't respond, but the way her hands gripped her backpack suggested she wasn't going anywhere. Greg stepped forward cautiously, the gravel crunching under his boots. He raised a hand, signaling to the driver. "Evening. You lost." The figure in the car shifted, leaning forward into the faint glow of the dashboard light. It was a man, middle-aged, with sharp features and a neatly trimmed beard. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, officer. Just passing through." Greg didn't buy it. The man's tone was too smooth, too rehearsed. He glanced back at Amara, who was visibly trembling now, her head lowered as though trying to make herself invisible. Something was definitely off. "Is that right?" Greg said, keeping his voice steady. "This area isn't exactly on the way to anywhere. What brings you out here?" The man's smile faltered slightly. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat, "Just looking for someone." Greg felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Looking for someone, at this hour? The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You wouldn't happen to have seen a girl, would you? Young, about this tall." He held his hand up in an approximate gesture, carrying a bag. Greg's jaw tightened, his eyes flicked to Amara again. She was staring at the ground now, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for something. "What's your business with her?" Greg asked, his tone growing sharper. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Just need to have a word with her, that's all. She left something behind, and I'm here to get it back." Greg's gut was screaming at him now. This wasn't just a coincidence. He didn't know what Amara's story was yet, but it was clear she didn't want to be found. He stepped closer to the car, his stance firm. "Well, I haven't seen anyone like that. If you've got business here, I suggest you take it up during the day when the station's open." The man's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a hard stare. "Appreciate the advice, officer," he said, his voice colder now. Without another word, he shifted the car into reverse and backed away, the Satan's taillights disappearing into the night. Greg stood there for a moment, the silence ringing in his ears. Something about that encounter left him uneasy, like he'd just brushed against the edges of something far bigger than he realized. He turned back to Amara, who was still sitting on the bench, looking even smaller now. "Amara," he said, walking toward her, "I need you to be honest with me. Who was that man?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her backpack, and her eyes stayed glued to the ground. I don't know," she said finally, but her voice wavered. Greg frowned. "That's not going to cut it. If you're in some kind of trouble, I need to know." Her head snapped up, and for the first time, he saw something else in her eyes. Desperation. "You wouldn't believe me," she said softly. Greg crouched down in front of her, trying to meet her gaze. "Try me." Amara hesitated, her hands trembling. Finally, she took a deep breath, like she was summoning all her courage. "He works for someone," she said. "Someone dangerous. I got away from them, but they're looking for me. They don't want to let me go." Greg's chest tightened. "Got away? Are you saying you were being held somewhere?" Amara nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. They said I owed them, she whispered, for things I didn't even do. And when I couldn't pay, they made me stay. They made me work for them. Greg felt a wave of anger rising in his chest. Trafficking. Exploitation. He'd heard stories like this before, but seeing someone so young, so scared, made it hit differently. How long? He asked gently. Months, Amara said, her voice barely audible. I thought I'd never get out, but I saw an opening and I ran. I've been running ever since. Greg exhaled slowly, trying to process what she just told him. This was bigger than he thought. And now, with that man showing up, it was clear they weren't going to stop looking for her. You did the right thing by running, he said. But you're not safe out here. We need to get you somewhere secure. Amara shook her head vehemently. No, if they find out where I am, they'll come for me. They always do. Greg placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Not if I can help it. Trust me, Amara. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she gave a small nod. Good, Greg said, standing up. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. As they walked back to his patrol car, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whoever was after Amara wasn't going to give up easily, and if they were willing to send someone out here in the middle of the night, they were serious. He opened the passenger door for her and waited until she climbed in before walking around to the driver's side. As he started the car, his mind was already racing, formulating a plan. But deep down, he couldn't shake one question. Asterisk, how far were these people willing to go to get her back? Asterisk. As Greg pulled away from the park, the soft hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, a quiet contrast to the storm raging inside his head. The streets felt too empty, too still, for what was happening. He glanced over at Amara, who sat silently in the passenger seat, her fingers tightly gripping the strap of her backpack. Her eyes stared out of the window, focused on nothing. Greg could see the weight of the past months in her eyes: betrayal, fear, exhaustion. She was trying to push it all down, trying to act like she was fine, but there was no hiding the scars. Where do you want to go? Greg asked after a few minutes, breaking the silence. He knew he couldn't just take her to the station. Whatever people were after her, they would have people watching. I don't know, she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just need to be safe. Somewhere they can't find me. Greg's grip tightened on the wheel. He wasn't sure how far this would go, but if it came to it, he wasn't backing down. His job was to protect people, and this girl, despite the tangled mess she was in, needed his help. He drove in the direction of the outskirts of town, where there were some vacant homes and abandoned buildings. It wasn't the safest place, but it was quiet, isolated enough to buy them some time. As he turned onto a less-traveled road, he checked the rearview mirror just to be sure. The streetlights had long faded into darkness, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, swallowing the street behind them. Who are they, Amara? Greg asked gently, his voice low. Who's looking for you? She shifted in her seat, her hands still trembling. I don't even know all their names. They were part of something bigger. I thought I was just helping out a few people who needed it, but I didn't know what they really wanted until it was too late. Greg's brow furrowed. Helping who? What kind of work were you doing? Amara sighed, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. It started with small things, running errands, helping them get what they needed. But then it escalated. It was like I couldn't leave. Every time I tried, they found a reason to pull me back in. They called it owing a debt, but they never really told me how to pay it back. Then one night, I found something I didn't want anyone to know about. And that was it. That's when I knew I had to get out. Greg's mind raced. What kind of dangerous operation had she stumbled into? The way she spoke about it made him wonder if she had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. His gut told him this wasn't just a runaway case or a mistaken identity. Whatever she had found, it was enough to make powerful people go to extreme lengths to find her. As they reached the outskirts of town, Greg took a sharp turn onto an old dirt road that led to a dilapidated building. It had once been a small factory, now abandoned for years, its windows shattered and its exterior covered in graffiti. It was a place where no one would think to look for someone hiding out. "I'll stay here with you for the night," Greg said, pulling the car to a stop. He looked over at Amara. "We can figure things out in the morning. I'll contact some people who can help." Amara nodded, but the hesitation was still there. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, her body tense. "What if they come here? What if they're already looking for me?" "They won't find us here," Greg assured her. He wasn't sure if that was true, but he needed her to believe it for now. He reached into the back seat and grabbed a flashlight, then opened his door. "Stay in the car. I'll check the area." Amara didn't argue. She stayed where she was, her hands clutching the edge of the seat. Greg's flashlight illuminated the path ahead as he walked toward the building, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustling sound in the distance set his nerves on edge. He had no real plan other than to make sure they weren't being followed. But the deeper he ventured, the more unsettled he felt. It didn't make sense. Why would someone go to such lengths to track down a girl like Amara? And why did she seem so certain she was in danger? As Greg moved around the corner of the building, a faint noise made him freeze. It wasn't the wind or the normal sounds of the night. Someone was out there, just beyond the light. His heart pounded as he slowly edged forward, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then, as quickly as the noise had started, it stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. A figure stepped out from behind the building, a man, tall and silent, his face shadowed under the brim of a cap. Greg's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. But before he could make a move, the man raised a hand, his voice calm but edged with warning. "You're wasting your time," the man said quietly. "She's not going to be safe here, you know." Greg froze. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something about the way he spoke, confident, like he knew exactly what was going on. Greg's instincts flared, and he stepped back slowly, his hand never leaving his sidearm. "What do you know about her?" Greg demanded, his voice low but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, as though checking for something or someone. "I'm not your enemy, officer," he said, still keeping his distance. "But the people she's running from, they're not going to stop. Not until they get what they want." Greg narrowed his eyes. "Who are you? What do you want with her?" The man didn't flinch. "I don't want anything, but they'll come for her. And when they do, it won't just be you they're coming for." Greg's blood ran cold. "What do you mean by that?" The man's expression was unreadable. "You're in this now, whether you like it or not. They'll know you helped her. They always know." With that, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Greg standing there, more uncertain than ever. What had he just heard? What had this man meant by "they always know"? Greg made his way back to the car quickly, his heart racing. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to keep Amara safe. And as he slid into the driver's seat, his thoughts were consumed by one thing. Someone was watching, and the danger wasn't just from the people chasing her. It was also closing in on him. Greg's mind was racing as he drove back to the car. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something much bigger than he had anticipated. The man's warning echoed in his ears. Asterisk, they always know. Asterisk. He slid back into the driver's seat and glanced at Amara. Her eyes were wide, alert, like she was waiting for something, anything, that would tell her it was safe to breathe again. Greg could tell she hadn't heard the conversation, but the tension in her body told him she felt it too. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "We need to leave," Greg said, his voice low. He had no idea where they would go, but staying here was no longer an option. The man's warning had put him on high alert, and something about the way he said it made it feel like they were already too late. They needed to move fast. Amara hesitated, her gaze flicking to the road ahead, and then back to Greg. "Where'll we go?" Her voice was shaky, but she still held onto a thread of hope. "I don't have anywhere left. I've run out of places." Greg's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'll figure it out. Just stay calm." But calm was impossible. The hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end, and his instincts told him that danger wasn't just closing in, it was here. As Greg began to drive down the same dirt road they had come in on, he kept his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The road ahead was quiet, but that didn't ease the growing feeling that they were being hunted. The silence in the car was unbearable. Amara, who had been looking out the window, finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go back to them. I'll never go back." Greg didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he had a plan anymore. His mind was clouded with too many questions. What did Amara witness? Who were these people she had gotten involved with? And why had that man been so sure they were being watched? Just as the thought crossed his mind, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror, a set of headlights. Not too far behind them. Greg's pulse quickened. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just following them, they were tracking them. He glanced at Amara, who was staring straight ahead, her face pale, the grip on her backpack tighter than ever. She knew too. "They're here," she said, her voice strained. Greg didn't need any more confirmation. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The headlights in the rearview mirror grew brighter, closer. Whoever was behind them wasn't wasting any time. Greg's heart was hammering in his chest, and his thoughts were moving at lightning speed. Should he head back toward town? Should he find another route to lose them? But he didn't have the luxury of time. The car behind them was relentless, gaining on them with every passing second. "Hold on," Greg shouted as he swerved the car to the left, taking a sharp turn onto another narrow, winding road. The tires skidded against the gravel as he forced the car to navigate the turns. He glanced at Amara. She was gripping the seat, her eyes wide in terror. "Why are they after me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What did I do?" "I don't know," Greg said, his voice tight. "But we're going to figure it out." Another look in the mirror revealed that the car was still there, close enough now that Greg could make out its shape. He wasn't fooling anyone. He needed to shake them off, but the road was getting more treacherous the further they went. The headlights were now almost on top of them. There was nowhere to hide. Amara's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. "They won't stop, not until they get me." Greg's stomach twisted. He knew it was true. Whoever these people were, they didn't play by the rules. And if Amara was right, if she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to, they wouldn't stop at anything to cover their tracks. As he sped through the winding road, Greg's eyes darted to the sides, searching for any signs of a way out. Then, just ahead, he saw it, an abandoned barn. A perfect place to hide, at least for a little while. "Hold on tight," Greg shouted, swerving once again as he made a sharp turn toward the barn. The car hit the dirt path leading up to it, the tires kicking up dust as they raced toward the large wooden structure. He brought the car to a screeching stop just inside the barn's entrance, the sound echoing through the empty space. Before the dust had even settled, Greg was out of the car, rushing to Amara's side. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. "I'll check the perimeter." Amara didn't argue. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, as she stayed in the car, her breath shallow. Greg moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest as he surveyed the area. The barn was dark and quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the cracked walls. He moved to the back of the building, his hand on his weapon, every sense on high alert. But the more he looked, the more he realized how exposed they were. The feeling that something was wrong settled deeper in his gut. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they were being boxed in, trapped. It wasn't just the car behind them anymore. There were more moving parts, more people. He turned quickly and made his way back toward the car, his mind racing with options. "Amara," he called out, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. "We have to move. They're too close." When he reached the car, he froze. Amara wasn't there. A jolt of panic shot through him. Where was she? Amara, Greg shouted, panic creeping into his voice. He scanned the area, his mind already running through every possible scenario. Had she run? Had they found her already? Then he heard it. A soft sound from behind him. The creak of a door. Greg spun around, his heart in his throat. There, standing in the doorway of the barn, was Amara. Her back was to him, but the way she was standing, frozen in place, told him everything he needed to know. Something was wrong. A voice, cold and low, echoed from the shadows. "She's not going anywhere, officer." Greg's blood ran cold. The man who had warned him earlier, the one who had disappeared into the night, he was back, and this time he wasn't alone. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Amara, still frozen in place, her back to him. The voice from the shadows, cold and calculated, had sent a chill through his spine, and he knew that whatever was about to happen, it was no longer just about protecting a girl on the run. The stakes had just been raised, and something far more sinister was lurking in the dark. The man in the doorway stepped forward, and Greg's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but it was no use. The situation was spiraling too fast. The dim light from the barn's open door revealed only fragments of the man's figure, tall, intimidating, and completely calm. His voice had no trace of fear, no hesitation. "You're in too deep, officer," the man said, his words cutting through the silence. "Both of you are." Greg's eyes narrowed as he moved toward Amara, his voice low but firm. "Get away from her." His instincts screamed at him to act quickly, but the man's presence was like a wall, blocking his every move. "Your protectiveness is admirable," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But it won't save you." Suddenly, Greg felt a sharp, sudden shift in the air, a movement from behind him. He turned just in time to see another figure step into the barn, another person, this one with the unmistakable silhouette of authority. A cop. Not just any cop, though. This one was wearing the same uniform Greg wore. "Detective," Greg muttered under his breath. It was the last person he expected to see in this place, especially after everything that had happened. What the hell is going on here? The man in the shadows gave a small, satisfied smile, as if the reveal had been carefully orchestrated. "I thought you'd figure it out eventually," he said. "But it seems you needed a little push. This is your partner. Or should I say, your real partner." Greg's blood ran cold. The man he'd worked with, the one he trusted, the one who'd been in charge of the very investigation that had led him to Amara, was standing before him. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was by design. "Is this some kind of joke?" Greg demanded, but his voice wavered. The walls seemed to close in, and the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. "You've been working with them all along." The detective stepped forward, his face expressionless. "You have no idea what you're involved in, do you, Greg?" His tone was almost pitying now, as if he were explaining something to a child. "This isn't just about one girl or a few shady characters. This is much bigger. You've been chasing the wrong people." Greg's mind was racing, but nothing made sense. His partner, his trusted colleague, was part of this web of danger. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He had been led into a trap, but why? Why Amara? Before Greg could say another word, the detective's eyes flicked to Amara. "She's not just a runaway," the detective continued, his voice growing colder. "She's the key. The whole damn thing revolves around her." Amara's body tensed, and Greg could feel her fear even from a distance. She hadn't moved a muscle since the moment the detective stepped into the barn, and Greg knew she was terrified. But now there was something else, something she hadn't shared with him. The detective's smile widened, like a predator playing with its prey. "You still don't get it, do you? This girl holds the answers to everything. All the questions you've been chasing, all the lies you've been fed. Amara is the one who can bring it all crashing down." Greg turned to Amara, searching her face for any sign that she understood what was happening. But her eyes were wide, confused, almost desperate. "What's he talking about, Amara?" Greg asked, his voice low but urgent. Amara looked back at him, her face pale, as if the weight of the truth was finally sinking in. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know what I was getting into. They told me I was just helping. They said it was nothing." She shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow and guilt. "I never asked questions. I didn't want to know." Greg's mind raced as he tried to piece it together. What had she stumbled into? What kind of power did they have over her? It was clear now that whatever this was, it went far beyond a simple case of betrayal. Amara wasn't just a girl on the run. She was the reason everything had gone wrong. Before he could react, the detective took another step toward them, his movements slow, deliberate. "You have no idea how big this is, Greg. What you're about to discover is going to change everything. The truth you're chasing doesn't belong to you." Greg clenched his fists, the realization starting to hit him hard. "You're with them, aren't you?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. The detective's eyes locked with his, no trace of doubt in his expression. "Of course I am. You really think this was some random assignment?" He chuckled darkly. "You were never supposed to find out, Greg. You were a tool, just like everyone else who thinks they're playing the game. But Amara..." He paused, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "She's not just another pawn. She's the queen." Greg's stomach turned. The detective's words were starting to make sense, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. Amara was at the center of something far larger than either of them could have imagined. She wasn't just a witness to a crime, she was the key to something much darker. As the detective moved closer to Amara, Greg took a step forward, instinctively putting himself between them. "Stay away from her," he growled. But the detective only laughed. "You're too late, Greg. She's already in it. We both are." Greg's pulse was racing now. There was no turning back. The world he thought he knew, the world he'd trusted, was falling apart. And standing in front of him was a choice: follow the detective, follow the path he had been on, or risk everything to protect Amara from whatever dark truth she had uncovered. Amara, her hands trembling, whispered just loud enough for Greg to hear, "I didn't want any of this, but I think it's too late to walk away now." The tension in the barn thickened, and Greg felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. What was the truth? And what would it cost him to find out? The stakes were higher than ever, and the resolution was still a distant hope, hanging just out of reach. Greg's hand was shaking as he gripped his gun, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The detective, his partner, his ally, was standing just a few feet away, a smug smile on his face, his eyes cold and unfeeling. The barn felt smaller with each passing second, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He had to act. He had to protect Amara, no matter what the cost. "You think you're in control, don't you?" Greg said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He kept his eyes fixed on the detective, trying to ignore the fear creeping in. "But you're wrong. You've been using me this whole time, and I'm done playing along." The detective raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "It's not about control, Greg. It's about survival. You'll understand soon enough." Greg's mind raced. What was the detective really after? What do you mean by survival? And what role did Amara play in all of this? "I won't let you use her anymore," Greg growled, his eyes flicking back to Amara. She was standing there, trembling, her face pale with fear. He could see the weight of the situation bearing down on her, but there was something else in her eyes now, something determined. It was as if, in that moment, she had made her decision. Amara stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't understand, Greg." She paused, looking at the detective and then back at Greg. "It's not about what you think. It's not just about the people chasing me. It's about something much bigger." Greg's heart skipped a beat. What was she saying? What could possibly be bigger than the nightmare they were already living? The detective's smile widened as he turned to Amara. Go ahead, tell him. Let him in on the secret. Amara's gaze met Greg's, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she seemed to be truly at peace with what she had to say. I'm not just a witness, Greg. I'm the one who's been keeping it all together. She swallowed hard, as if the words were difficult to say. The people after me, they're not just criminals. They're trying to destroy everything we know. And I've been stopping them. For years. Greg's brain struggled to catch up with the words. Asterisk, she's been stopping them, asterisk. What do you mean? How? How could you? Amara took a deep breath. It's a network. A massive one. They've been pulling strings in everything, in the government, in the media, in law enforcement. They've been behind so much corruption, so many lies. But I was the one who got close to the heart of it. I found the source. The people they've been using to control everything. Greg could barely breathe as the enormity of her words sank in. All this time, he'd thought she was just a victim, a girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now it seemed like she was the one who had been keeping the system from collapsing. And you, the detective said to Amara, are the one who's been keeping them in check, keeping them from going public. You've been the last line of defense. His voice was low, almost admiring. But now, it's time for the truth to come out. And that's why you have to die. Greg's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about something much darker, something twisted. The detective wasn't just working with them. He was part of the very thing Amara had been fighting against. And now he wanted her dead to silence her, to prevent her from exposing everything. Why? Greg asked, his voice hoarse. Why kill her? Why not just let it all come out? The detective laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You think the truth would set us free? No, Greg, the truth would destroy us. It would tear everything apart. We're too deep into this. We're too far gone. He looked at Amara with a mixture of disdain and grudging respect. You were the safeguard. Greg's heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this happen, not after everything they had been through. But as the detective stepped closer, raising his weapon, a sickening realization settled over Greg. He couldn't just fight his way out of this. They were too outnumbered. They were trapped. But then, in that split second, Amara moved. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for Greg's permission. Without warning, she lunged at the detective, knocking the gun from his hand with a surprising strength. Greg was frozen, unsure of what was happening, but the moment was clear. Amara wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was fighting back. The detective staggered back, clearly stunned. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, unsure of his control over the situation. Amara moved swiftly, her hands trembling but resolute as she grabbed the gun and pointed it at him. This ends now, she said, her voice shaking but fierce. Greg's mind raced. What had just happened? Was she really going to kill him? Amara, Greg said, his voice strained. Don't. But she didn't lower the gun. Instead, she turned to Greg, her eyes wide with fear. He won't stop until I'm dead, Greg. He's just one piece of the puzzle. If I don't do this, they'll keep coming. This has to end. Greg didn't know what to do. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been carrying. He didn't want her to have to make this choice. But in that moment, he knew it wasn't just about survival. It was about taking control of her fate, about ending the cycle that had bound her for so long. Amara's breath was ragged as she turned the gun on the detective. This is for everything you took from me, she whispered, her voice full of raw emotion. And with a single pull of the trigger, everything changed. The shot rang out, echoing through the barn. The detective's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Amara stood over him, her chest heaving with emotion. She dropped the gun and sank to her knees, her face contorted in a mixture of relief and sorrow. The weight of what she had just done was too much to bear. Greg walked slowly toward her, kneeling down beside her. He didn't say anything at first. Words couldn't undo what had just happened. But then Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with both pain and a strange sense of peace. "It's over," she said quietly. Greg nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. It was over. But as he looked at the lifeless body of the detective, and then back at Amara, a thought flickered through his mind, a question that still lingered unanswered. What had really been happening all along? What had they been fighting against, and who else was involved? The truth was finally out, but was it too late to stop the forces that had been set in motion? The barn was silent now, but the echoes of everything that had happened would stay with them forever. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The barn was still, the heavy silence hanging in the air like a dense fog. Amara sat on the floor, her hands resting in her lap, her face drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. The gun lay next to her, forgotten for now, its purpose fulfilled in the most tragic of ways. Greg stood a few feet away, watching her, trying to process everything that had just happened. His mind was racing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a strange sense of calm between them. It was over, but the weight of it all still pressed down on him. Greg slowly knelt beside her, unsure of what to say. How do you comfort someone who has just taken a life, even if it was in self-defense? He had spent the past few days chasing shadows, uncovering lies, but now, looking at Amara, he understood that nothing could prepare either of them for the truth they had just discovered. The world they knew was not what it seemed, and while the detective was gone, the organization he had been part of, the vast network that had been pulling the strings, was still out there. "Are you okay?" Greg asked softly, his voice breaking the stillness between them. Amara looked up at him, her eyes red from both tears and the weight of the reality she had just been forced to face. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay," she whispered, "but I don't have to run anymore. I don't have to hide." Greg nodded. There was a strange sense of finality to her words, like she had finally found a sense of closure. But he knew that the fight wasn't over. Not really. Amara had stopped one monster, but there were so many more out there. People just like the detective, just like the ones who had been after her for so long. It was a thought that gnawed at him. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that lingered. Amara hesitated before speaking, her eyes distant as she stared at the detective's body. "No, I don't think it's over, but I know what I'm up against now." She looked back at Greg, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm not alone anymore." Her words were a small comfort, but Greg wasn't entirely sure that was enough. He knew the battle she had fought had left deep scars on her, scars that would take time to heal. And yet, there was something else in her eyes now, a spark of determination. It was a change he hadn't seen before, but it was undeniable. She was no longer the scared girl on the run. She was someone who had found the strength to fight for what mattered. And in that moment, Greg realized something important. He wasn't just there to protect her anymore. She was standing beside him now, an equal in this fight. The question of the next steps was unavoidable. Greg stood, his mind churning. There were so many things they needed to do, but he couldn't ignore the sense of urgency gnawing at him. He couldn't let this moment of victory slip into complacency. He had seen what the organization was capable of. The people they had been running from weren't just rogue criminals. They were part of something much larger. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about exposing everything, bringing down the entire system that had allowed these people to thrive. "We have to go to the authorities," Greg said, his voice firm. "We need to make sure they don't get away with this." Amara shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. The people behind all of this, they are in the government, in law enforcement, everywhere. If we go to them now, we're just handing them the victory. We have to go public. We need to make sure everyone knows the truth." Greg could feel the weight of her words settling on him. She was right, of course. The corruption wasn't just in a few bad apples. It was systemic. Going to the wrong people now would only put them in more danger. They needed to expose it all. They needed to take the power away from those who had been pulling the strings. "Then we fight back," Greg said, determination hardening his voice. "We go to the media. We make sure the world knows what they've been doing. We take away their power." Amara's eyes brightened, but there was a caution in her gaze. It won't be easy. There will be people who try to shut us down, people who will try to discredit us. But if we can get the right information out there, we might just stand a chance. Greg nodded, his mind already mapping out the path ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. They would have to be careful, smart, and most of all, patient. But they weren't alone in this fight. Together, they could expose the truth, tear down the walls that had been built to keep them silent. For the first time in a long while, Greg felt hope stir in his chest. He extended his hand to Amara, a simple gesture of solidarity. She looked up at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she took his hand. They didn't need to speak. The understanding between them was clear. They had both lost so much, but in this moment, they had found something else, the strength to continue, to finish what had been started. As they walked out of the barn, the dawn was breaking. The first rays of light cut through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was a new day, but the road ahead was still uncertain. There were battles yet to be fought, dangers they hadn't even imagined lurking in the dark. But now, they weren't running from the darkness anymore. They were walking toward it, ready to face whatever came their way. The twists and turns of their journey weren't over, but for the first time, they knew what they had to do. Together, they would expose the truth, no matter the cost. And as the sun rose higher, painting the world in golden light, Greg knew that they would fight with everything they had, because in the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure that the truth was heard, no matter how painful, no matter how long it took. This wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning.